It's awesome that people from all over the world traveling to tourist spots across and around the reservation see the work and are intrigued by it. But my primary audience and the people I'm responsible to is people on the reservation.
Hello and welcome to Art Restart, where we explore how artists are reinventing their fields and building a new landscape for the arts. I'm Rob Kramer, the founder and CEO of Kramer Leadership, whose mission is to advance leaders for the greater good.
And I'm Piercarlo Talenti, the producer and editor of this podcast, brought to you by the Keenan Institute for the Arts at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts. In this episode, we bring you our interview with photographer, public artist, activist, and physician Chip Thomas.
Chip moved to the Navajo or Diné Nation in northern Arizona in 1987 to work as a physician in a community with limited health care and thus repay a National Health Services Corps scholarship. The plan was to stay there for 4 years. 34 years later, Chip Thomas is not only still living and working as a physician in the Navajo Nation, he's also become an artist beloved by his community and increasingly by admirers from all over the world.
Since 2009, Chip has been printing out large-scale enlargements of his photos of the Diné community and affixing them to structures throughout the Diné Nation, reflecting the beauty and stories of the people and their culture back to themselves. Sometimes the murals also tackle the many social and environmental issues, such as the sickening effects of uranium mining in the mid-20th century, that have challenged the Diné for generations. During the pandemic, Chip created murals to share vital health information with his community, which was, as we all know, disproportionately affected by COVID-19.
Chip spoke to us from his home in Inscription House, Arizona. I asked him to tell us how he found the resilience to navigate the devastating past year in the Navajo Nation.
Yeah, well, it's an ongoing process. The pandemic is still with us. Just the Thursday and Friday of this week, we got 7 positive tests back for coronavirus after not having had any over the past, say, 5 weeks, or just maybe 1 or 2. So, there were some people who attended a super spreader event, which I think was a religious event locally. And so we were, getting the virus type to see which strain we're dealing with. But the point being, the pandemic is still with us. I'm still navigating all this. But again, the thing that is saving me is the opportunity to go out and create art. Like right now, as I look outside, it's I just looked at my thermometer and it's 70 degrees. I live at 6,500 feet. It snows in the winter. It's not unusual to get lows in the single digits here. And it's been, cold pretty much for most of the winter. So just having an opportunity to go outside and work, exercise helps me. I cycle still, generating endorphins and enkephalins. But I think the focus of my art really is using it as a tool to build community. And within community, there's opportunities to process all sorts of stuff. So, for example, the UN, World Health Organization, got in touch with me within the past 6 months saying they're aware of the work that I'm doing and the impact it appears to be having. And the World Health Organization is also aware that parallel with the pandemic, there is an escalating mental health pandemic or crisis with, more suicides, eating disorders, depression, maybe even some of the gun violence that's happening now as a result of, things that have happened during the pandemic. With the amazing amount of loss, jobs, lives, and so on. Yeah, so the Painted Desert Project, which I do, is like one of 5 community-based art projects that the UN is going to work with over 2021 to come up with an art-focused response to community grieving and healing. And after I finish this interview, I'll be driving to a really beautiful canyon site where there's an abandoned motel that's been stripped of its material, so it's been trashed. But we're going to lead an effort to people coming together to clean it up and maybe use it as a site for storytelling of the impact of the pandemic on the community, but also as an opportunity for healing, coming together. So being in community, sharing with people, making art is what is helping me get through this. It's really a counterbalance to the intensity of the work that I do in the clinic. A lot of times I will say in talking with people that the clinic work is all about trying to create an environmental wellness within the individual, to restore them to optimal health. But the placing of what I consider positive images in the community is trying to create an environment of wellness in the community and how people are feeling about, I don't know, about themselves, about community.
When you first arrived at the Navajo Nation, I'm sure you were seen as an authority because you're an MD. How long did it take for you to be seen to be trusted as an artist? Because what you do, you take such intimate photos, I think, and then put them up in very public spaces, which is, I think, a scary thing to do for many people. How did you negotiate that relationship with the community? And did you make any mistakes along the way?
Yes. Yes, mistakes have been made. um, well, yeah, so I'm doing this work in a community that doesn't have, say, the disposable income for there to be a lot of murals along the roadside. So at the time I started doing my wheat pasting project, I wasn't necessarily putting work up in places where there was already street art. And, it's a complicated history of photography with indigenous nations, and how they're represented and oftentimes idealized and made to seem static and represented in a way that, yeah, it doesn't give the impression that Native people are still here. But being influenced by the visual storytelling of Eugene Richards, Eugene Smith, basically the Magnum group of photographers, I have always been about trying to get in there and go deep and to, hear those stories and use the imagery as an opportunity to hopefully for people to learn more about the community and to hear some of those stories. But the trust building just takes time. There's an expression within the community that I learned shortly after I came that unless you've been around for a couple of years, people don't really take you into their trust. It's really about them observing you and seeing if your words are consistent with your actions. And it's been a funny thing because I've worked with a number of people in the clinic over the years, and certainly there are other physicians whose interpersonal skills of communication are more effective than mine. And I always felt that I wasn't as well liked as them. Having been here for so long, people, appreciate my commitment. And one of the things that I hear from patients that I appreciate is that they feel like I listen to them and that I care, which makes sense because the art project is really coming from a place of love. I would like to think that when I engage people, engage community, I'm coming from a place of love. So by the same token, I would hope my medical practice is coming from a place of love. And yes, I think people pick up on that and have, like I said, they see the images. The project, of putting pictures along the roadside is now primarily a conversation with the Diné people. It's awesome that people from all over the world traveling to tourist spots across and around the reservation see the work and are intrigued by it, but my primary audience and the people I'm responsible to is people on the reservation. For example, when I first started doing the work and wasn't really engaging the community, I thought, okay, how can I do this objectively so that no one group feels excluded here on the reservation? And it occurred to me that there are three primary spiritual practices on the reservation. There are people who are Christians, there are people who are traditionalists, who still take part in traditional ceremonies and do things like sweats. And then there's the Native American Church, which is the group of people who go into teepees for a night and have a prayer circle to bring community support to someone who's called a patient. But it also involves the ingestion of peyote. And I thought that by representing or having imagery from people in those communities, it would make the work more acceptable. But so I put a photograph of a friend who had a peyote bud in his hand, and he was showing it to me. So I photographed the palm of his hand, and then made kind of a mandala out of his hand with the peyote bud, and pasted that on the side of a little roadside stand, not knowing that the owner was a fundamentalist Christian who had absolutely no tolerance for the Native
Oh.
American church, who,
Oh,
took the
gosh.
piece down within 24 hours and then, found me and berated me. And this was at the time when no one knew who was putting pictures up. There was another example. There's a developer in Scottsdale who wants to put a development in on the east rim of the Grand Canyon, which is on Navajo Diné land. And he wants to put in a 1 mile tram to take approximately 10,000 people a day down to a site in the Grand Canyon at the confluence of the Little Colorado River and the Colorado River, with a restaurant and to make it a little resort area on land at the top of the canyon that has no development. Is in a community on the reservation that has an unemployment rate probably around 60%. I mean, there's just no jobs in that community, but the development itself is not sustainable in terms of taking that many people to the site, which, by the way, is a site that's sacred to all of the Pueblo tribes from this region, and it's also the area where the Zuni, the Hopi, would do their treks to get salt once a year. So the more traditional people, were opposed to this development. And I realized, hey, I have a skill set that can amplify voices advocating for positive change within the community. So I approached the traditionalists and said, would you like me to put some posters up along the roadside speaking to how you're feeling about this issue? And I worked with a couple matriarchs from the community to make imagery, which we put up. And there were some other people from the community who came to me and said, hey, look, um, there are no jobs here. This is not your community. And, why don't you go paste your own house? And they buffed or painted over everything. So yeah, I've made mistakes along the way.
So, kind of along those lines, with the impacts you've made both as a physician and an artist in the community, someone might say you're a change agent or you're a leader or you're an artist leader. What role do you see yourself playing in your community these days?
Well, you asked me that question. I just got a text from someone I called medicine in for, and I
Oh,
missed the
uh-huh.
question.
So, given the your work as a physician and as an artist in this community, how do you view yourself in your role? How would you label yourself? What do you do in the community?
Oh, that's a good question. um, how do I label myself? Everyone in the community knows me, first and foremost as a doctor they can trust, someone they want to see, by and large, and that's why I'm here. And yes, I do art in the community, and I try to use it as a tool to build community. But I don't necessarily, put that first and foremost when I'm. Well, it's an interesting thing because I mentioned earlier I went to Wake Forest and then I went to Meharry Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee, and none of that came easily. I wasn't a scholarship student in that I had to work for everything and just spent a lot of time studying. And art, on the other hand, is something that's all self-taught. It's really kind of me expressing what I'm feeling, speaking from my heart. Because of my medical training and because that's the work I've done, like I said, everyone here knows me as a doctor, but in truth, even though I worked in a dark room for my home dark room for 22 years, I never really thought of myself as an artist. It wasn't until I started going out into the community and playing with the architecture, of walls and buildings that I started thinking of myself as an artist. When I started my art project in 2009, I had never heard of community practice. I didn't go to art school. Um, I'm going to take a step back further. I mentioned I'm from North Carolina. 69 and 68, the Raleigh public school system was desegregated, and that's when busing started. And once kids got to the school they were going, there was a lot of violence happening. And my mom was a school teacher in the public school system, and this was 68, 69. There was a lot going on in the country at that time. King was assassinated tomorrow, 1968. And so my parents were concerned about the amount of violence in the public school system, and were looking at sending me to a military institute in North Carolina or Virginia, which I really didn't want to do. But, again, just a fortuitous thing happened where my parents, the summer of 68, no, the summer of 69, summer of Woodstock, took a cruise with my grandma, who normally would have babysat me, or not. I wasn't a baby at the time, but I would have stayed with her for 3 weeks. And my father learned of this Quaker camp up in the mountains of North Carolina where they do rafting in the river, horseback riding, camping, just all the things I love doing. I'd never been horseback riding, but so I got to go into this small Quaker community in Silo in 1969. And the four of the guys in my tent were going to this school called the Arthur Morgan School, which was an alternative Quaker boarding junior high school with 24 kids. It's funny because the history of Black Mountain College.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This school was kind of set up, yeah, like that, in that it was a work learning experience. The first time I went into a dark room, I was 13 years old at the school. That summer, I got my first camera. I started shooting black and white film at that time. So, the experience of making decisions by consensus and living, working, creating together was instilled in me at a young age. So when I am asked, in terms of being an agent of change in the community, that junior high Quaker school experience was all about building community. Every spring, we would break up into small groups. And again, there were only 24 students in the school, and do field trips to different parts of the country. And I twice went to there's a Beaufort and a Beaufort. One is in North Carolina, the other one is in South Carolina. But we would go to the Black community where the Gullas and Geechees were. And there was actually a small Black Quaker community there, but we would just volunteer and do community service in that community, for the 2 weeks we were there. Yeah, that type of grounding in community has stuck with me and led to me being where I am now for 35 years, doing kind of longitudinal work. I mean, that in and of itself, to have a physician in a community for this long is becoming rare. I think if there's any agent of change work, it just comes from being a part of a community and having an open conversation with that community. And when I say open, it's one that everyone can see.
What could be changed or reinvented in order to make sure that communities had access to art and that their, as you call it, their overall wellness could be improved through art?
Yeah, well, There, I saw a survey, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 months into the pandemic this year, or 2020, and it asked people to rank in order a list of people or occupations they considered the most essential and the occupations they considered the least essential. And yeah, you can
Uh-oh,
see
this
where
makes me nervous.
yeah, you can see where this is going. But to make a long story short, yeah, people in healthcare, responding to the emergency of the pandemic were rated at the top, and at
So
the very
you're at the
bottom,
top and the bottom of the list.
that's where I'm
Right.
going with this. So I represent both ends of the spectrum. So I'm actually
Yes.
all about advocating for the I just a deeper appreciation of the value of art. And I think the only way communities get that is when they see it and feel it, It's like, yeah, I don't know that the Navajo Nation would have decided, and the Navajo Nation still hasn't decided, say, to invest in an arts program. But people here appreciate the value of public art in a way that maybe they didn't 15 years ago. And there are more public art projects starting to happen on the Navajo Nation. For this UN WHO project I'm doing, I brought together a diverse group of people. There's 7 of us on my team, but we represent community organizers, art therapists, artists, activists. Half of the group is Native, actually over half. So I think, when people form teams to look at any type of civic engagement or even the construction of parks and buildings, it would be nice to have someone with an arts background as a part of the planning team because, I think artists are great at thinking outside the box and maybe taking chances that people in other disciplines are less likely to do.
Let's say a young artist is listening to this and wants to do the kind of socially, kind of the community practice work that you're doing, maybe go into a rural community and be of service through her art. Is there one piece of crucial advice you would give this artist?
Yeah, breathe, give it time, It really helps to come to a place and just listen, not to come in with ideas and solutions. For example, one of the things that occurred to me, the UN asked me why my project is necessary, wanting me to I guess justify it. And it occurred to me that my project is not necessary. I am working in a community where of people whose ancestors came to this area 10 to 40,000 years ago, depends on which migration one considers from the Siberian area. And, so the people here are resilient. They have ways of adjusting to times of privation, such as we're going through now. So it's really not what can we bring to help them, but what can we go and patiently listen and learn from and maybe work with and build relationships around. But that doesn't happen quickly. So I mean, I'm fortunate in that I have an excuse for being here. I have my job that allows me to be in this community and to have these interactions. It would be hard if I were living off the Navajo Nation land and trying to maintain these
And you
relationships.
also, it sounds like you have a deep love for the place. It sounds like you
Yeah,
do have a somewhat spiritual connection to it. You are invested in the geography and the culture deeply.
yeah, no doubt. And not to get religious, but was it Moses who spent time in the desert and had a transformation? I mean, there's something transformative just about being in a kind of stark but beautiful place over an extended period of time. So I guess I would tell a young artist to go to the desert and and wait.
You know what I really take away from this interview is his humility and respect for the community. and realizing how long it took for him to put down demonstrably deep roots in the community in order to be
Mm,
trusted.
right, right.
It reminds me of a story in one of the three cities I lived in recent years. I'd want to call this person out, so I want to be vague about where it was. I went to at the public library. I went to a presentation by local artists about kind of creative placemaking, and one woman got up. She and a partner, I think they were both white women, had opened up a contemporary art gallery in a gentrifying, historically African American neighborhood.
Interesting.
And she explained that right away, she and her partner had set up a program where they would bring in local neighborhood kids to teach them how to appreciate contemporary abstract art.
Mm.
And, I don't want to fault her intent because she was clearly wanting to do the right thing. But I doubt that if she'd spent more than a few months listening to what the community wanted, she would have come up with the same plan. I mean,
Yeah.
how many of the parents in this rapidly gentrifying neighborhood were concerned that their children didn't appreciate contemporary art,
Right.
Chip reminds me that no one, not even a well-meaning artist, can presume to know what a community wants until they've not only lived in that community for a good period of time, but also shown themselves to be humble and respectful, right?
Oh yeah, and now he's 30 plus years into it. You're making me think of a couple other examples like that where a person I know moved to a small rural community in the state he and his wife lived in, and one of the first things he chose to do, because they knew nobody and no one knew them, but one of the
Mm-hmm.
first things he chose to do was join the volunteer fire department, and
Mm,
found quickly it was a great way to get ingratiated into the community because it was a place of need and it was a place of where the community supports itself.
right. I do wish more artists were living and working in rural communities. We hear so much about the
Right,
rural city divide in this country. And
right,
one way to bridge that would be for artists to work in rural communities. But, rural relocation can't be just like, I'm going to go spend the summer in such and such place,
right,
right?
right, exactly.
An artist needs to demonstrate her commitment to putting down those roots
Yes.
and to listen to the community.
Yeah, who and how they serve and what they're there to do.
And just looking, I encourage people to go to our website, uncsa.edu/art restart, because we do have pictures of some of his art up there.
Right.
And it's so beautiful. It's hard to describe how beautiful it is. And I hope we get to see it in person someday, Rob,
God,
because
yes, I'd
seeing
love
it
to
in the
go.
landscape must be a completely different experience.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. If you enjoyed this interview, please leave us a rating, which will make it easier for more people to find us.
And also give us positive reinforcement, which never hurts.
Desperately
Right?
need, please, people. It's desperate for it.
Our theme music is by Shanghai Restoration Project. I'm Piercarlo Talenti.
And I'm Rob Kramer. Thanks so much for listening.